Hi, I'm Jeff Terrell and welcome to A Million Movies. Now when I look down the bench at all the movies about basketball that have ever been made, there's really only one go-to basketball movie for me. And of course, that's going to be the story of Coach Dale and the 1952 Hickory Huskers. And since my March Madness bracket was busted a long time ago, I'm taking a break from the games to cover some facts you really don't need to know about the 1986 classic Hoosiers. So let's huddle up and get ready for some Indiana basketball. And I know I don't say this enough, but
I love you guys.
Alright, well let's start by pointing out that while Hoosiers is not based on a true story, it absolutely was inspired by a true story. Now until 1997, schools in Indiana weren't classified by the size of the school. That meant that whether you were the biggest high school in the state or one of the smallest, you had a chance to compete for the state championship. In 1954, the Milan Indians, with a total enrollment of just 161 students, became the smallest school to ever win the single-class state basketball title. Their win over Muncie Central High School became known as the Milan Miracle, and is still talked about as one of the great David and Goliath victories in sports. And if you know when to look for them, you can spot two people who played key roles in that championship game in 1954 in the movie. First, Milan player Ray Kraft landed a role as the manager of Hinkle Fieldhouse. That's him welcoming the team when they first arrive in Indianapolis.
Kind of off the record, I think this is the most exciting thing that's ever happened to Indiana basketball, so we're all behind you. Good luck and tear 'em up.
Thank you.
He's also the voice you hear when the team is told it's time to take the court before the championship game.
Hickory, it's time to take the floor.
The other veteran of Milan's championship game was announcer Hilliard Gates. In 1954, Gates was at the microphone calling the game for radio audiences across the state. And when it came time to cast the role of the play-by-play announcer in the movie, Gates got that part.
An improbable confrontation in the illustrious history of the Indiana High School basketball tournament.
Filling out the roster for the Hickory Huskers turned out to be a bit of a challenge. The director and producers were more concerned that the guys could really play basketball than they were about their acting experience. In fact, Hoosiers was the first movie any of the players ever appeared in. Wade Schenck, who plays Ollie, was a senior on his high school team when he was cast in the film. One day during production, he got homesick and left the set to go see his old team play. The crew ended up calling his mother to get him to come back to film his scenes. And Kent Poole, who plays Merle, was a small-town Indiana basketball star whose team fell just one shot short of moving on in the semifinals in 1982. With his small-town roots, the director gave him this classic line, knowing he could deliver it with real emotion.
Let's win this one for all the small schools who never had a chance to get here.
And finally, Steve Holler, who plays Raid, was on the Indiana State Championship team in 1984. He was playing for DePaul University when he heard about the casting call for Hoosiers. He landed the part, but once the movie came out, the NCAA launched an investigation to determine if Holler and other college athletes who played members of the competing teams had violated any regulations that might lose them their amateur status. The NCAA ultimately determined that Holler and the other players were paid as actors and not as basketball players, but they still gave them each a 3-game suspension, and in at least Holler's case, they fined him 5% of the money he earned for being in the movie. The phenom shooter on the Hickory Huskers was Jimmy Chitwood, as played by Maris Valanis. Of all the players cast for the team, Maris was the only one who had not played basketball in high school. In fact, he'd been cut from the team all 3 times that he tried out. He got the part thanks to a visit the casting director made to St. Luke's to scout players in their Monday night basketball league. Maris got hot that night and started hitting shot after shot. The casting director pulled him aside after a game and encouraged him to show up for the casting call the next day. When Maris got to the auditions, he saw there were already about 500 other guys already there. He stood in line for about 5 minutes and was just about to leave when the casting director came out and spotted him in line. Casting director took Maris to the front of the line and straight into the auditions, where, of course, he got the part. Now, it had to be a big thrill for the players to all see their names up on the big screen, but thanks to a clever set decorator, the guys didn't have to wait until the end credits for that to happen. In the locker room scene, just before the championship game, Coach Dale points out the names of the top players on the South Bend team. Each of the names on the boards were the real names of the actors on the Hickory team. Having actors who can actually play basketball well helped in ways the production team didn't fully appreciate when shooting began. Because the players were able to hit a high percentage of their shots, the director and cinematographer were able to capture full plays all in one shot. Now, after the film was completed, the producers commented on how much being able to show the shot and basket being made all in the same sequence helped the film seem more authentic. They said it helped the audience feel that these players were really playing in these games. A great example of being able to rely on the shooting of their cast was in the scene where Gene Hackman delivers a monologue to Jimmy, letting him know that as a coach, winning at all costs is no longer his priority. The wide shot of this monologue was done in a single take, and Maris never missed a single shot until the very end of the scene. Later on, Maris explained that he was barely even listening to Gene Hackman deliver the lines. Maris said he was 100% focused on not missing any of his shots so he wouldn't ruin the take. Even though all the guys cast as players on the team could play basketball, they needed to adjust their playing style to mirror the way basketball was played in the early 50s. That meant no dribbling behind the back or between your legs, and getting really good at the 1-foot push shot, as well as the occasional granny shot on the free throws. The style of play wasn't all that needed to be reworked. Players and referees' uniforms, scoreboards, and even the free throw lane needed to be adjusted. Back in 1952, the free throw lane, or the key as basketball players call it, was just 6 feet wide, with a 12-foot diameter free throw circle at the top. And if you're wondering why it's called a key, it's because this narrow lane in the free throw circle made it look a lot like a keyhole. In the 1951-52 season, the NBA changed to the 12-foot wide key we all know today, but high schools and colleges were still on the 6-foot wide key we see in Hoosiers. And if you look closely at the key in Hickory's gymnasium, you can see the outline of the more modern 12-foot wide key that the production team needed to remove in order to get the court to look like it would have in 1952. With the players, the uniforms, and the gym all ready to go, all that was missing was the coach. Now, originally the character of Coach Norman Dale was scripted as a younger man, but after the screenwriters saw Paul Newman in The Verdict, they started thinking about different aspects they could explore with the character if he was an older man. They got even more ideas for the character after seeing Robert Duvall's performance as Max Sledge in Tender Mercies. Now, even with the decision to change the coach to an older man made fairly early in the process, the idea of the coach being younger still found its way into the final script in this scene.
You're not the new coach.
Are you expecting somebody different?
Younger, I guess.
I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Jack Nicholson expressed a lot of interest in playing the coach, but he had scheduling conflicts due to a lawsuit with MGM that kept him from working for about 6 months. With Jack's blessing, the team offered the role to Gene Hackman. But a few months after Hoosiers hit the theaters, Jack Nicholson ran into the director David Anspaugh at a restaurant. Jack was extremely complimentary about Hackman, Dennis Hopper, and the players. And when Anspaugh commented that he still wonders what it would have been like with Jack playing the coach, Jack put his arms around the director's shoulders and replied, "A mega hit, kid. It would have been a mega hit." There are several reports of Gene Hackman being great with the players, including helping them through a week-long acting workshop before filming started. But there are also many reports of Hackman giving director David Anspaugh trouble, starting with the first scene on the first day of shooting. Hackman challenged the director and the screenwriter constantly over the entire 39 days of shooting, even going so far as getting his agent to try and get Anspaugh fired. Ultimately, it all drove Anspaugh into a panic attack where he woke up one morning and the room was spinning and he couldn't walk. Now, most of the issues between Anspaugh and Hackman happened off camera, but at least one part of it made it into the movie. In a montage of the Hickory team playing, you can see Hackman and Dennis Hopper sitting on the team's bench. Hackman leans over to Hopper and says something that makes Hopper laugh out loud. The two weren't mic'd for the shot, so it wasn't until years later that Anspaugh found out that Hackman had turned to Hopper and said, "Hopper, I hope you've invested well because you and I are never going to work after this movie. This is a career-ending film for the both of us." When shooting finished, the production team still needed the principal actors to come back in to overdub some of the dialogue. Hackman was the last actor they called, and they were concerned he might refuse to do the dubbing. When Anspaugh called him to set up the recording session, Hackman said he wanted to see the rough cut first. Anspaugh set up a screening for him, knowing that if Hackman didn't like the movie, he most likely would not come in for the dubbing session. The next morning, Hackman showed up, he walked into the room and looked Anspaugh in the eye and said, "How the F did you do that?" On the other side of the equation, reports are that Dennis Hopper was great on the set and got along with everyone. As the town drunk who becomes the team's assistant coach, Hopper, who had just gotten sober himself in real life, needed to perform a couple of scenes like he had been drinking. He remembered a technique that he saw James Dean use when they were both on the set of Giant. In scenes where Dean's character needed to appear drunk, Dean asked director George Stevens for a 30-second warning before filming started. During those 30 seconds, Dean would spin around. Then, when action was called, he'd be off balance enough to appear like he'd been drinking. For Hoosiers, Hopper asked for that same 30 seconds so he could spin around before he needed to walk into the shot. Oh, and here's a quick bonus fact about James Dean. In 1951, Dean played on the Fairmount High School basketball team in Fairmount, Indiana. He played against the Milan Indians, the team that inspired Hoosiers. Now, Dennis Hopper took his role as shooter seriously and even suggested cutting one of his scenes. Originally, his character was supposed to leave the hospital where he was going through rehab and show up at the final game. Hopper felt that Shooter would take his sobriety seriously, so he asked that his character be shown listening to the game on the radio from the hospital instead. Now, that championship game has its own mythology around it, but one of my favorites is something that happens before the game even starts. The national anthem scene isn't in the script, but the director thought it would be good to include the anthem in the movie. They didn't have time to audition groups, so they reached out to a local country group, the Travelairs, to come in and sing it. The version we see in the movie was the first time they'd ever sung the anthem together in front of an audience or even for the production team. They nailed it on their first take. One of the titles suggested for Hoosiers was The Last Shot, so let's talk about the last shot of the game for a minute. The shot had been planned and rehearsed carefully, so everything would be ready to go once the camera started rolling. The only problem was that during the rehearsals, the nerves may have been getting to Maris and he was not living up to his Jimmy Chitwood mystique. Years later, Steve Holler explained that all throughout the rehearsals of the shot, Maris had been bricking every shot he took. The director came out to the team and said no matter if Maris makes the shot or not, everyone was going to act like he hit it, including the extras who were going to rush the floor. So, with the cameras rolling and the clock ticking down, Maris pulled up for his jump shot and he nailed it. The team converged on Maris and the crowd converged on the team, creating a moment that Steve Holler, who had actually won a state championship back in high school, said felt 100% just like winning a real championship game. I recently watched Hoosiers for the first time in several years, but this time I watched it with my wife and daughters, none of whom had ever seen it before. Now, aside from asking me to explain what a Hoosier was a few dozen times, they also had questions like, when did Myra and the coach start to like each other because that kiss comes out of nowhere? And when did Buddy get back on the team? So, if you have similar questions, the basic answer is that the original cut of the movie was just shy of 3 hours long. The studio insisted that it be cut down to under 2 hours, so some scenes were cut out, including 2 scenes where we see the coach and Myra becoming friendlier with each other as their romance builds, and a couple of scenes where Buddy transfers to play for another school before coming back to Hickory to ask for another chance to play with his old team. Now, if you're interested in seeing some of these deleted scenes, be sure to pick up the double DVD collector's edition of the movie. 30 minutes of these cut scenes are included in the bonus DVD. Well, there you have it, some facts you don't need to know about Hoosiers. And if you know a great piece of trivia about this movie that I didn't cover here, please share it in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll come back and watch more episodes of A Million Movies.